Welcome to the first event in a three-part series, Human Trafficking and Forced Labor, an introduction to the problem, those fighting it, and what you can do. We convened this spring 2021 semester at the University of Notre Dame, virtually via Zoom, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on the third Thursday of the month in February, March, and April. Tonight, we focus on an introduction to the problem, and we hope you'll join us again on March 18th when we focus on those confronting the human trafficking and forced labor issue in the realms of business, government, law enforcement, and victim leadership. Details can be found on any of the websites of the sponsors I'm about to introduce. And if you've RSVP'd for this, you'll be getting, if you haven't already, calendar invitations to hold those dates. My name is Dan Graff, and I'm a labor historian here at the University of Notre Dame, as well as the director of the Higgins Labor Program, one of the three sponsors of this series. The Higgins Labor Program is a unit of our Center for Social Concerns, devoted to research, advocacy, and outreach on labor questions, using the lens of Catholic social teaching as a way to frame our efforts. What are the principles of CST when it comes to work? The dignity of labor and those who perform it. The right of those who work to share in the fruits of that work and to participate in the economic decision-making that impacts their lives. And a commitment to solidarity with working people in the name of the common good. Please check out the Higgins Labor Program's Just Wage Initiative, the Labor Song of the Month, or our plethora of other programming at our website. I want to thank Judy Benchar of the Higgins Labor Program and many other colleagues at the Center for Social Concerns, especially our communications team, for their help in supporting and promoting this series. We're joined in co-sponsoring the series by the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership at the Mendoza College of Business. The Deloitte Center provides programming, research, and insights to help leaders develop integrity and create effective organizations that contribute to a more just and humane society. Thanks especially to Brett Beasley, the Associate Director of the Deloitte Center, for his active role in organizing this event and for his behind-the-scenes hosting of tonight's webinar. Finally, last but not least, we're also joined by co-sponsor Imago Dei, Notre Dame, a new initiative formed by alumni and friends of the university focused on ending human trafficking and restoring human dignity. Imago Dei is working with student groups, institutes, and centers across the university to increase awareness, promote advocacy, and support experiential learning. In addition to collaborating on such things as this speaker series, Imago Dei has established several summer service learning projects and internships, which can be found through the Center for Social Concerns website or the Imago Dei website. Thanks to my colleagues from Imago Dei for initiating the idea and doing most of the work for making this series happen. I'd now like to introduce one of those colleagues, Vickie Seeger, who will introduce tonight's featured speaker and run the discussion session following the talk. Ms. Seeger spent a career in several leadership roles with General Reinsurance Corporation. Most recently, she worked as Regional Underwriting Officer in North American Treaty Reinsurance Operations, where she led underwriting and actuarial teams in establishing, maintaining, and implementing underwriting and pricing protocols. Her areas of expertise include business analytics, operational excellence, product development, and regulation. Seeger earned her BA in Management and Economics from Luther College and her MBA from the University of St. Thomas. I met Ms. Seeger, Vickie, when she joined Notre Dame in 2019 as a fellow of the university's Inspired Leadership Initiative, a program for accomplished individuals who have completed their chosen careers and they come to spend an academic year with us here at Notre Dame. Vickie attended several Higgins Labor Program events last academic year before the pandemic shut us all down, and she and some of her Inspired Leadership Initiative colleagues have remained a part of the Higgins Labor Program community. I was grateful that she reached out several months ago to see about my interest in participating in a series on human trafficking. I'm so glad that she did, and I turn to her now to introduce tonight's featured speaker. Vickie.
Thank you, Dan. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Professor Terry Coonan. Terry is founding director of the Florida State University Center for the Advancement of Human Rights. The center provides pro bono legal assistance to victims of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and works closely with state and federal law enforcement officials in the investigation and prosecution of trafficking cases. Professor Coonan teaches in the FSU Law Department and serves as the appointee of the Florida Attorney General on the Florida Statewide Council on Human Trafficking. He has trained law enforcement agencies, service providers, and judges on human trafficking and related legislation. He has also consulted with the White House, Department of Justice, and the Department of Transportation on human trafficking and immigration. And of course, Terry is a proud Notre Dame alum, earning a BA in History and Theology and a Master's in Divinity. Before I turn it over to Terry, a comment about the format tonight. Terry is going to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, and that will leave a lot of time for discussion. Please use the Q&A button to send in questions. Do this throughout the session, and we'll turn to as many of these as we can get to at the end of Terry's remarks. Terry, we are so glad to have you with us tonight, and I will turn the controls over to you.
Good. Well, thank you, Vickie, and thank you to Professor Graff and to the Higgins program on labor. It's a great privilege for me as a Notre Dame graduate, but also as a human rights advocate to join all of you today in looking at what I really believe is going to be one of the really significant human rights issues of the 21st century. Very appropriate that we would start this series looking at labor trafficking, really systematic human rights violations that, as we'll see tonight, happen in all of our own backyards. It's not something that occurs in only remote parts of the developing world. What I hope to do is walk all of you through a little bit of where we've seen labor trafficking occur here in the United States, and also have a look at what is it that we can do to combat this. I know later speakers will also address this. Before I begin, though, a special thanks, especially to the Center for Social Concerns. This is a part of Notre Dame that is near and dear to my heart. It was still a relatively new venture when I was a student at Notre Dame, but Father Don McNeil, Sister Judith Ann Beatty, they impacted, I think, an entire generation of us who had the privilege of actually meeting and working with them decades ago. And they have very much shaped the careers in the justice field that a number of us have pursued. So many thanks to that Center for Social Concerns and to the ongoing mission. Let me begin tonight by sharing my screen, and we'll see. Let's see. Okay, I think we should be good today. What I will do is look really at how labor trafficking is in all of our backyards. It is an issue that we have done fairly extensive work on in our Human Rights Center here at Florida State University, beginning with victims, with survivors. And it's those survivor voices that greatly inform our teaching, our research, and increasingly a great deal of the policy work that we do as well. So we'll look really at what it is that survivors have taught us, and how is it that the law field and really the American policy field has actually tried to respond to this. Okay, a quick introduction to human trafficking in general. It's really a newly defined crime. It is a crime that has only been defined under US law for really the last 20 years. It was introduced into US law by what's called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. This was landmark legislation passed back in 2000. And for the first time, it criminalized forced prostitution, which we refer to as sex trafficking, but also, and very importantly, forced labor trafficking. Though sex trafficking claims a lot more of the interest of the media throughout the United States, the imagery and much of the focus of the media can be on sex trafficking cases, but we have actually more labor trafficking cases and more labor trafficking victims than we do sex trafficking. We'll talk about how it hides in plain sight, how it is very much a part of our US reality, whether we know it or not. We talk about it as modern day forms of slavery. It is very different than chattel slavery of, again, the 19th century that we saw in the American South. It is not race-based. There's no ability to legally own anyone like you were able to do 150 years ago, but it's rather modern day forms of exploitation and slave-based practices or slavery-like practices. And what the TVPA did, it identified that sex trafficking or labor trafficking was exploitation that was induced through one of three means: either physical force, fraudulent promises, or psychological coercion, force, fraud, or coercion. And that is very much a legal standard now, that prosecutors, when they have a case to take into a state or a federal court, in order to get a conviction for human trafficking, they have to prove that force, fraud, or coercion was used against a victim to take away their ability to walk away from that work situation. What it did really, the TVPA in 2000, it addressed gaps that had emerged 12 years before in a 1988 Supreme Court case. It was called the Kosminski case. It was a labor trafficking case that occurred really only a couple hours from Notre Dame in a small community, Chelsea, Michigan. And it involved the Kosminski family that held two young men literally in a form of slavery on their dairy farm. It's interesting to read that opinion. The opinion refers to these young men as mentally retarded. We would now say they were developmentally disabled or challenged, but they were held for over 5 years on that dairy farm. And the legal issue that faced them when they tried to prosecute the Kosminski family was that physical force had not been prevalent in terms of how they were coerced into working. Instead, they were told that terrible things might happen to you if you go down to the end of the road, if you ever leave this dairy farm, that it was threats and it was basically the imposition of fear that kept them there on that farm. And the Supreme Court case in that year said that this did not arise to the level of slavery. It did not arise to the level of the 13th Amendment understanding of slavery as we then knew. And what the world, especially the advocate world, very quickly realized was that a great many of the modern day forms of slavery are not actually the result of physical force. And it took Congress about 12 years, but finally in the year 2000, they, in a sense, expanded the notion of what constituted this kind of exploitation. And they said that not only physical force, but also fraud or fraudulent promises to a victim or psychological coercion. And by that, we mean really the invisible chains of modern slavery. Threats against the person, against their family, anything that might induce them entirely just through their own mind to maintain or to remain in a situation of slavery. So that it was this largest gap, psychological coercion, that I think was probably the most important part of the TVPA in greatly broadening our understanding of how it is that modern human trafficking can occur. What we'll look at tonight, though, is labor trafficking, not sex trafficking, which is a separate part of the TVPA, but rather labor trafficking, forced labor. And the Trafficking Victim Protection Act defined labor trafficking as what we call a segmented crime. It's any number of different types of criminal offenses that could lead one to be basically exploited for forced labor. It can mean recruiting someone, harboring them, transporting them, providing them to a third party, or obtaining that person for labor or services, using, again, force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting someone to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery, which are all different legal nuances for forced labor. Now, despite the name, labor trafficking does not require any kind of movement. Oftentimes we think of movement when we say the word trafficking. Drug trafficking usually means the movement and the sale of drugs. Human trafficking and labor trafficking is different. There is no requirement for movement or transportation or even for deceptive recruiting. That these can be relevant factors, but none of them are required. It's simply an act of exploitation against an individual. We talk about it as hiding in plain sight. Labor trafficking exploits US citizens as well as foreign nationals. The first cases that we saw back in the 1990s were all large cases involving forced labor of foreign nationals. Here in Florida, where I work at the Florida State University, we saw actually some of the largest labor trafficking cases that we've seen even now. One that I was involved with that involved 700 migrant farm workers down in the Immokalee area in South Florida. But recently, we've also seen vulnerable US citizens as well. Many of our foreign national victims actually are here on legal work visas. A great many of them are not people that we would refer to as undocumented immigrants or undocumented persons, but they're rather here on legal work visas. But many of those visas are issued not to the foreign national, but to their employer. And we'll see as we look at really the business model here in the United States that is still very pervasive, how this lends to human trafficking, that many of our migrant workers are only able to work for the company that petitions for them. And that is an open invitation, many of us as advocates feel, to human trafficking. We'll also see how human trafficking and labor trafficking is fueled by the demand for cheap labor in numerous US economic sectors. A colleague of mine, Lou DeBaca, who was our US ambassador on human trafficking, was actually often fond of saying that sex trafficking is about making money, labor trafficking is often about saving money. And we'll see that it's in this quest to save money, to get ever cheaper labor. Oftentimes, this is where labor trafficking occurs. We'll also see in a number of the cases that we'll look at tonight how many of the offenders in labor trafficking cases are subcontractors. They are providing typically the low bid for services to larger US companies, and it is very often those subcontractors who are the traffickers. What we'll see most of all, however, is how pervasive in 21st century the US business model, human trafficking, and in particular labor trafficking can be. What I'd like to do now is walk you through a number of the cases to give you some visuals about labor trafficking. Oftentimes there's this sort of gut reaction that it's not as bad as sex trafficking. But when we see the level of victimization, all the types, the coercion that are used against labor trafficking victims, I think we'll see that the human suffering is also significant in these cases. One of the first cases that drew the attention of the US community was what's called the Monte case. This was sweatshop trafficking, and it took place in a suburban sweatshop in East Los Angeles. What it was 70 Thai women who were held in this building that you see here at the left. The first view that you see is the front view of that building in what was significantly a residential neighborhood in El Monte. The back view showed what really was going on in that home. Barbed wire and fences that absolutely prevented anyone from escaping from the premises there. And this was where, again, one of the largest and most significant initial labor trafficking cases occurred. It was 70 Thai women who were actually smuggled into the United States, most of them on false passports. They were brought to this sweatshop where, among other things, they were working oftentimes 16 hours a day sewing Garfield stickers onto sweatshirts or t-shirts. They were kept, again, in this home surrounded by barbed wire. And they were kept there not just physically, but also by what we call debt servitude. All of them had been told, you owe $20,000 to a group of us from Thailand who have smuggled you here into the United States. And The traffickers in this case used what we call the company store notion. Everything that the workers needed, whether it was food, whether it was recreational commodities, toiletries, was actually sold to them, but at exorbitantly high prices. And the debt that each one of these workers owed continued to go up. That it's a tactic that we often see labor traffickers use. It keeps people coerced into that situation as the debt that they're initially told they owe never gets any lower. And this was very much the tactic that the Thai traffickers used in that case. Not all of our victims are foreign national victims. And this is especially true, and we see this now, is that a great many of our vulnerable US citizens are also trafficking victims. This was a case called the Evans case that took place in Palatka, Florida. Again, about an hour outside of Jacksonville. And this was a case that took place on potato and cabbage farms, farms that were owned by a US citizen who was himself a trafficker. And what this trafficker, Mr. Evans, did, he recruited people from homeless shelters. This was the vulnerability that he looked for. In particular, he looked for African-American homeless men that he could lure out of homeless shelters. He recruited in shelters in Jacksonville, Orlando, Tallahassee. He went as far west as New Orleans, and he looked for a specific profile of victim, typically an African-American male, not only homeless, but who also had a substance abuse or an alcohol abuse issue. And he rightfully knew that as homeless persons, there was not a family that would miss them. Even staff in many of our homeless shelters understand that they work with transient populations. A homeless person may stay for a while in a shelter and then move to an entirely different city. And Mr. Evans counted on that. He counted on the fact that he could find these vulnerable US citizens who were both homeless and had a substance abuse issue. They were then taken to this remote labor camp. You can see the picture of it at the side here, a big sign that said, "Warning, no trespassing." It may not be real evident from the picture, but the barbed wire at the top of that fence, it angled back towards the camp. It was not meant to keep people out of the camp. It was meant to keep people in that camp. And that's exactly what it did. Many of the homeless people were held there for several years and routinely exploited. Mr. Evans used both debt servitude, but also isolation to coerce the labor on this potato and cabbage farm. He paid his victims nightly in alcohol and crack cocaine. Again, he exploited the substance abuse issues that many of them had. And on Friday, when they should have been, say, paid $500 for the work that they had done on that camp, they would be told, well, you actually owe me $500 for the crack cocaine or the alcohol or the unlicensed cigarettes that I sold you. A number of the victims in this case, sadly, were US veterans as well. Veterans who had fought in the first Gulf War. The America that they came back to was not an America that welcomed them, but rather one that exploited them. And those, again, victims, many of them held for over a year. The case was interesting how it came to light as well. It was the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that identified this case. Mr. Evans not only had little regard for human life, had little regard for the environment. He was dumping the outhouses from this camp directly into a tributary that led to the St. Johns River, which is the water supply for the city of Jacksonville. It was the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, regulators that actually identified what the source of that sewage was, and it led directly to this camp and to the discovery that over 70 African-American men in modern 21st century America were being held as slaves. But in this case, it was not race-based as much as it was vulnerability-based, their homelessness and their substance abuse issues. That was agricultural trafficking. Let's move to the hospitality industry. This was another human trafficking, a labor trafficking case. Took place in what we call the Panhandle section of Florida, not far from FSU, what we call our sugar white sand beaches here in Florida. And this involved the trafficking of several hundred young women, also young men, who came to the United States on what are called J-1 visas. These are training visas, and they were exploited in the hotel industry. All of them, as it turns out, were studying hospitality management back in Eastern Europe. They were from Russia, the Ukraine, Poland, the Czech Republic, Moldova, and they signed a contract with what they thought was a legitimate business in the United States that would allow them to come and work for 3 or 4 months in a hotel, or many of them thought they were going to work at Disney World. What awaited them was not a great experience as an intern, but rather labor trafficking. And the contract that they signed, though they did not know it, was with Russian organized crime. And it was Russian organized crime that was at the heart of this case. This was the hotel, again, up in Destin, Florida, a beautiful, beautiful beach, where many of the victims were taken. They got off the plane in Orlando where they thought they were going to work in Disney World. And they were met by the Russians, who would tell them, we have good news and bad news. The opportunity you had at Disney World, well, it disappeared. But here's the good news. We have a job for you. It only pays $2 or $3 an hour, but you can work 60 to 70 hours a week at this Hilton hotel making beds. And you'll get to stay in the condo right behind the Hilton. You can see the condo in this photo where the young women lived. Many of them, as 20 of them, sleeping on a floor in a single room. And they were exploited, labor trafficking. Russian organized crime took great care to avoid labor trafficking. The young women were all paid typically $2 to $3 an hour. They were recycled every 3 or 4 months. All of them knew they had a plane ticket to go back to Russia at the end of the summer to resume their studies. They also knew it would have cost about $2,000 to leave early. So I think most of them reasoned, especially with a number of the victims that our Human Rights Center worked with, better to just stick it out. When else could they live right on the beach, stay with other Russian girls, not make much money, but have an opportunity to simply live in the United States and, again, have a little bit of an experience of working in the hospitality industry. When the case was actually brought to the Hilton placed all the blame on its subcontractor. That, of course, was Russian organized crime. That crime syndicate had come in with the lowest price. They were a subcontractor who basically underbid all the other US citizen subcontractors to get the job making those beds. It turned out to be not just one, but about 7 different organized crime syndicates. Normally, they competed viciously with one another, but in this case, they collaborated, that it was labor trafficking and that it was quite profitable. It went on for several years. One group would be sent back to Russia or Eastern Europe, and a new group would arrive. The Russians were very careful to avoid sex trafficking. They knew that might draw the attention of law enforcement. Labor trafficking instead flew right under the radar screen. Ultimately, they discovered that not only was it at this 5-star Hilton hotel, but that it was actually all over the Panhandle. There were any number of hotels that were engaged in what we'd have to call willful blindness. They looked the other way and were happy not to ask, why was that one bid so low? Ultimately, they discovered it wasn't just the Panhandle, it was all over Florida and the southeastern United States that this Russian organized crime group was operating. So again, that was trafficking in our hospitality industry. A quick look at also domestic servitude. Though we're focusing on business models that oftentimes involve corporations, this is private exploitation, house slavery. We see it all over the country. This was a particularly notorious case in Long Island, a 2007 case where a husband and wife, the Sabnanis, exploited 2 Indonesian women in their Long Island millionaire home, where they operated an international perfume company. And what they did is lured both of these women from Indonesia. The women were not young. They were in their 30s and 40s. These were not children by any means, but lured to the United States with the promise of a good paying domestic job. What awaited them was anything but. In one of the most brutal cases that we've seen that literally rose to the level of torture, they were beaten, they were burned, they were scalded, they were cut with knives. And the main perpetrator in this case was Mrs. Sabnani, the wife. When the women finally were able to escape, they went to a Long Island Dunkin' Donuts in their neighborhood. The employees recognized, though the women could speak almost no English, but that there were signs of extreme physical abuse. Local law enforcement was called. Fortunately, they had just been given a training on human trafficking, and the Sobnanis were convicted of both labor trafficking and document servitude, basically keeping people's documents as a way to control them. Another typical tactic that labor traffickers use. Again, not that this involved a corporation or a business, but that it was meant to save the Sobnanis money. What they were able to save by using slave labor was something that they counted on as they operated their perfume company. Let's move to labor trafficking in industry. This was a very significant case called Signal International. It took place in the southeastern United States about 6 years ago. And what it involved was Signal International Marine Repair Company, a company that exploited over 500 skilled workers from India. This was not a case of willful blindness. It was a case where the company was actively involved in labor trafficking. They recruited workers for non-existent jobs and then defrauded those workers out of tens of thousands of dollars of what they called recruitment fees. Upon their arrival in shipyards in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, the workers were held in what was referred to as man camps. They were worked for long hours, many of them malnourished, fed very poorly, told that their families would be harmed back in India if they fled or if they complained. This was a civil lawsuit under the TVPA, which not only allows for prosecutions, but also for victims to sue their traffickers. And in this case, Signal International had to pay $20 million to those victims. The largest labor trafficking lawsuit in US history, but again, a very, very legitimate business, but that found it simply too enticing, this idea that they could use a form of slave labor to enhance their profits. So again, a reminder that our labor system, also our immigration system at times can lend itself to human trafficking. This really raises the final question that we'll look at for tonight. How do we hold corporations accountable for this kind of modern human rights violation? Corporations are notoriously slippery. Venue can be challenging when you decide to go after a corporation legally. The question of where is that corporation actually located? All of us that take any kind of civil procedures class in law school know that all corporations seem to be based in Delaware. That's where their headquarters are because of Delaware law. Very, very open to that. But that the corporations operate all over the world. So the question is, where would you actually sue or go after that corporation legally? They can be very difficult to prosecute criminally and also very difficult to sue if there's not an overt breach of contract. These are all the dilemmas that we actually face when trying to make businesses more accountable for human rights violations, but especially for labor trafficking. And the answer, as it turns out, and one that I think we can talk about a little more in the Q&A session, is consumer advocacy and pressures. And here, the great lesson learned was piloted by a phenomenal grassroots human rights group here in Florida. It's called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It is a group of indigenous farm workers, many of them Latin American, many of them from Haiti, from a number of different countries, that are the farm workers who pick our produce in South Florida. Turns out they pick the produce that basically feeds and provides the profits for especially the fast food industry. And it was the fast food industry that became the focus of this coalition of Immokalee workers. They discovered, and this again was not news to them, but that those picking America's food could not afford to eat well themselves. They were so poorly paid. They essentially discovered that the biggest purchaser of tomatoes, the tomatoes that they harvested routinely, working very, very long hours in the Florida sun and for very, very poor wages. Farm workers are exempted from our minimum wage laws here. So they asked Taco Bell, when they discovered that Taco Bell and its parent company of Yum Foods, they asked, would you pay 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes? And Taco Bell absolutely refused. Taco Bell said, why should we? Okay, we're not being sued. We haven't committed a crime. You can't criminally prosecute us. So no, we will not pay 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes. All right. The reality for our farm workers in America is that they're paid piecemeal. They are paid per bucket of tomatoes. And to make about $50 a day, they would have to pick over 150 of these buckets of tomatoes and run to the truck with them. They'd be given a ticket and they'd then run back to pick more tomatoes. A quite grueling lifestyle, and one that barely got them $50 a day, even after a full day of work. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers tried to figure out, how can we get Taco Bell to the table? They realized that a lawsuit would be ineffective, so instead they turned to the US public and specifically to college students, asking them to boycott Taco Bell. Now, Taco Bell, I think, was amused by this, paid it no regard at all. But what ensued was a groundbreaking boycott, went on from 2002 to 2005, in which the Coalition of Immokalee Workers essentially asked universities and college students to boycott Taco Bell, to not go to Taco Bell on Friday and Saturday nights, to not have Taco Bell be part of the food court at the university. And there was a groundbreaking boycott. Taco Bell lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in that 3-year period. Even more importantly, they incurred very, very negative publicity. Okay, college students rallied. Again, great conscience and great appetite for activism. And it was this call, 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes. Okay, the boycott went nationwide and Taco Bell gave in. Okay, break the chains, boycott Taco Bell. It was a tremendous lesson learned for many of us in the human rights field, but also for anyone hoping to impact corporate behavior, that legal channels might not be the most conducive ones, but that rather consumer activism was perhaps the way to go. A boycott of McDonald's followed. Okay, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers decided, okay, we've just, in a sense, brought Taco Bell to the table. Let's now target McDonald's. McDonald's initially refused. It took a 2-year period, but they ultimately broke down. They too agreed to pay 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes. Next, Coalition of Immokalee Workers took on Burger King in 2008. You can see the picture of the demonstrations, Exploitation King, and Burger King came to the table. Trader Joe's was the next target, and Trader Joe's told CIW, you don't have to boycott us. We'll actually agree to pay that 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes. Again, a tremendous campaign, a grassroots campaign on the part of this farm worker organization that brought corporate America to the table. And since then, the coalition has launched a wider version of this. They call it their Fair Food Program, and numerous different restaurant chains, very significantly Walmart. Walmart has been a key stakeholder in this process. Walmart, oftentimes it's criticized for different things. They've been one of the most important stakeholders in this Fair Food Program. And now it involves not just tomatoes, but many of the other things that are produced, that are grown here in Florida and across the country. The corporate lessons learned from this were very, very important. Number one, that consumers possess tremendous power to alter corporate behavior. And that, very importantly, college students are uniquely positioned to impact corporate decision-making. College students are a distinct subsector here in America in terms of the things that you as students buy, and that when you act collectively, you have tremendous power to alter what at times is corporate behavior. Okay. The business community and also legislators in the United States sat up and also looked at this lesson of what the Coalition of Immokalee Workers had shown. And our California legislators implemented in 2012 what they called the California Transparency in Supply Chains Law. And what that did, it required any company that does business in California that makes $100 million a year in gross profits. That seems like a lot, but in terms of gross profits, it really isn't. Any company that was operating in California that made that kind of money was required to post on their websites what they're doing to combat human trafficking. Again, it didn't prosecute them for anything unless they failed to put something up on their website. The entire purpose was to give consumers, but also shareholders, vital information. Shareholders are also greatly impacted by these kinds of boycotts. When Taco Bell or McDonald's or any company starts to lose money, it's shareholders that ultimately are negatively impacted. So that both shareholders and consumers, very, very important stakeholders. And what this California law did is that it basically gave consumers the power to look on those websites and to see, what has my favorite company done to combat human trafficking? Now, of course, some companies can game this, but it was, I think, the instinct that, again, consumers have a tremendously important role to play when we take the time to look at who is it that we give our consumer dollar to. This is a very, very important way to combat labor violations and labor trafficking as well, especially as it occurs in supply chains. There's a question of individual responsibility that I think all of us can take on when it comes to trying to impact corporations, trying to reduce labor trafficking or forced labor in supply chains where so much of it happens. Know your preferred commodities, know how they're made and how they're marketed. Think of the things that you buy. Is it fast food, fast fashion? Is it cosmetics, cell phones, iPhones? Your portable computer, and research those. Look to find out the company that you buy that from, what are they doing, especially to look at the possibility that forced labor might be somewhere in a supply chain. Very little of what we buy is actually made in America now. That's simply the reality of the 21st century business field. That's the business model that we all work with. About 93% of our clothes are made elsewhere. We need to research the companies that claim our consumer dollars. One way to do this, I have all my students that take my human trafficking class here at FSU at the law school look at this website. It's called slaveryfootprint.org, and essentially it's an app. It will ask you, what are the things that you buy routinely? What are your preferred fast foods? What's your preferred candy? What is your preferred types of watches or computers, cosmetics? What do you buy? And it will then tell you how many slaves work for you, okay? Again, it looks at supply chains, and it's a reminder about how all of us are very much living in an interconnected world in which our role as consumers is absolutely crucial to either providing for a better lifestyle for the world's workers or to contributing to their exploitation, okay? And a final slide tonight, just a reminder to me, and I think for so many of us that work in this human rights and human trafficking field, really the value of Catholic social teachings. This, I think, was one of the great enduring gifts that I received from the Center for Social Concerns at Notre Dame. But it's our Catholic social teachings, still sometimes referred to as our best kept secret in the Catholic Church. We'd like that it not be such a secret. But our Catholic social teachings begin with the inherent value of the human being. Human trafficking and labor trafficking is the antithesis of that. It treats humans as commodities, as people to either be bought or used or exploited. Our Catholic social teachings, absolutely crucial, and I think and a really important starting point for a different approach. How can we combat human trafficking? In the human trafficking field in which I work, there's a tremendous focus on what we call the victim-centered approach, whether it's laws or policy or working with survivors, everything that needs to be victim-centered. And here's where Catholic social teachings is, in many ways, I believe, the ultimate victim-centered approach. It's both systemic, it's holistic, it looks at the entire human person, and it is, I think, a tremendous framework for us And the Catholic Church, not accidentally, has been one of the great stakeholders in combating human trafficking. Catholic social teachings actually offer a far superior conceptual model to other approaches that we have seen in the last 20 years for combating trafficking. Initially, trafficking was combated with what we have to call a criminal justice approach. We'll prosecute it. It was important that there be greater criminal sanctions for trafficking, but at the end of the day, we can't prosecute human trafficking to eradication. It actually has to involve a lot of other forces as well. Just law enforcement will not be the driving force. It also can't be a question of border control or immigration. A great many countries, including our own country, again, between 2016 and 2020, employed essentially a border control paradigm that claimed that by clamping down on the border, by building walls, essentially by keeping immigrants out, that will actually combat human trafficking. Just the opposite occurred, actually. Human trafficking went more underground. Trafficking victims who were already here in the United States had a greater fear of deportation. And not surprisingly, both the number of cases that were prosecuted, but the number of victims that were also served went down. So that a border control or an immigration paradigm is not itself sufficient either. And finally, in the human trafficking field now, there are tremendous ideological battles over prostitution and the question of consent. Is all prostitution trafficking, or is it just forced prostitution? There's a quite vigorous debate that goes on there. At the end of the day, that is perhaps less useful than a Catholic social teachings approach that begins with that inherent value of the human being. So for many of us in the field, we're very, very grateful for our Catholic teachings and for the way that they continue to inform us. Okay, at this point, I just want to thank all of you, and let me then turn this over to Vickie, and I think she'll facilitate some question and answer for us as we go forward.
Thank you, Terry.
So,
you want to unshare your screen?
Absolutely. Let me get there. How's that?
Great.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, several questions have come in. Can you talk a little bit more about how labor trafficking violations might be curtailed more with through the Labor Department enforcement?
Well, absolutely.
Things like that.
Many of our labor trafficking violations occur in the parts of our U.S. economy that are least regulated by the U.S. government. I mean, it's no accident that much of the exploitation happens in areas where there's simply not a lot of federal presence or even perhaps state presence. So greater attention to those parts of our economy. I know I heard one commentator say that human trafficking, labor trafficking often occurs in what he calls the 3 Ds, dirty, demeaning, or dangerous sort of occupations. And these are often the occupations that US citizens choose not to pursue. It's oftentimes it's a foreign national, it's an immigrant doing that work. We saw it in the pandemic where a great many of what we called essential workers, well, many of them are immigrant population, and they're working in those areas with less regulation and therefore with a greater possibility of exploitation. I think part of it also has to do with reimagining our immigration system and not allowing for these visas that place an immigrant at the mercy of their employer. We talk about portability. Those immigrants should be able to walk away from an exploitative job and actually work for another employer, have the same kind of market benefits that US workers have.
And in the this year's Trafficking in Persons report, when you talk about those industries where there's more of this happening, it profiled the elder care industry. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're seeing this nationwide, and it oftentimes involves the workers in elder care facilities, many of whom come in on a visa. Many of them come in on H-2B visas. It's non-agricultural work. But again, that same dynamic, often they can only work for the company or the employer that that immigrates them, and that they end up being exploited as well. And again, it's also a kind of a job that a lot of U.S. citizens would not aspire to do, so that it's oftentimes our foreign national victims. We've had quite a few cases with Filipino victims working in many of those facilities nationwide.
Questions come in on the TVPA and whether it applies to forced labor in privately managed ICE facilities.
It does, and it should. And this has been the quite uncomfortable question for the U.S. government to have to answer. What kind of labor is actually required of many of those people that are detained in ICE facilities? It's one of many questions that is appropriately being asked of ICE right now. In terms of the large-scale detention, not to mention the separation of families, but that it absolutely occurs. And it's interesting that, I mean, one of the human rights bills that, one of the few that passed the US Congress in recent years was essentially a bill that looked at the situation of the Uyghurs in Northwest China. And it looked at the use of forced labor on the part exploiting the Uyghur citizens, these Muslims living as a minority population there, when ironically, many of the same questions should be asked of the immigration facilities here in the United States. So yes, we as Americans always have to hold that mirror up to ourselves as well. Human rights violations don't just occur in other parts of the world. And that would be a classic example of where more transparency and more accountability is really required.
And do you see that labor trafficking and sex trafficking are always separate and distinct, or is there a lot of interplay between the two?
Quite a bit. And that's a great question, because the way that the TVPA was drafted, it almost created two different constellations, when in fact, that's a quite artificial distinction, that many of our victims, the survivors that we've worked with, have been exploited both for sex and for labor trafficking. And what we're increasingly seeing is that many of our labor trafficking victims suffer the same kinds of sexual assaults that our sex trafficking victims do. Sex trafficking under the law only involves the commercial sexual exploitation of victims, so that unless it is prostitution done for a commercial reason, legally it doesn't add up to sex trafficking. But increasingly and almost routinely, we're seeing many of the young women who are trafficking victims, labor trafficking victims, have been coerced or have been exploited or brutalized through sexual assault as well. So in many ways, that's a distinction without a difference, and one that we would do well to not get too caught up in that dichotomy, even though the TVPA essentially put that out there for us.
Let me read this question to you. In your view, are human trafficking and forced labor a matter of bad apples, or more a predictable consequence of low wages and poverty, vulnerable persons?
Yeah, and there's one narrative that a great many people in our, whether it's our corporate world or whoever, say that it's just bad apples. Okay, these are just bad subcontractors. These are people that just, don't have any morals. The problem with that position is that, number one, the willful blindness that we have seen on the part of a great many companies, happy to look the other way and not ask, why is that bid so low for labor, whether it's picking tomatoes or making beds in a hotel? Why is it that, it's 80% lower than what these other US citizen subcontractors are offering? So the willful blindness question, I think, undercuts that argument that it's just bad apples. And then the way that our system, and again, especially our immigration system, with its lack of portability for immigrant workers, absolutely reinforces that tendency as well. So there are systemic changes that we have to make. It's not enough to just think there are bad apples, there are bad subcontractors or exploitative people out there. Systemically, we have to ask ourselves a lot of those questions in order to really get at the business model for labor trafficking that continues to thrive.
And you talked in your presentation about the employee at Dunkin' Donuts who recognized the situation. Is there anything that you can share that any of us as, just consumers, citizens could use to help us recognize trafficking
Well, absolutely. And if you get on the website of our Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, they have a whole series of trainings that can be downloaded, fact sheets, posters, things that can be put out in any kind of business. They have them tailored for the health industry, the medical industry, for teachers. They've done, I think, a phenomenal work. And this is the part of the US government that provides the benefits to human trafficking victims. If they're foreign national victims, they're given the same benefits as refugees are. And that, again, it represents that part of the, at least the US approach, is human rights based. The same things that we give to torture survivors or to asylum seekers, refugees that come to the United States, we also give to trafficking victims. So HHS has a great series of things that can be downloaded that way. The other great group, the Polaris Project, a great non-governmental organization that has done phenomenal work over the years, and they also have resources that can be downloaded from their website.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is, are there any big wage theft cases that have recently been litigated? This person is asked, has read today about a Walmart big violation.
Okay, I don't think I can speak to that in particular. I don't know of it. A number of our meatpacking plants have been looked at in recent years, and it's often under the guise of immigration enforcement when the dynamic that they may actually encounter is labor trafficking. Very, very important. Again, the whole politics of large-scale raids, oftentimes that falls under that immigration border control paradigm, which at the end of the day can be problematic. It can drive victims more underground, less likely to self-identify as victims, less likely to trust law enforcement, so that many of the raids are counterproductive if we think of them as meant to rescue workers, when in fact, oftentimes the operative mentality is border control or immigration enforcement.
Okay, switching gears, towards the end of your presentation, you talked about a victim-centered approach. Can you give a little bit more detail or background on that?
Yes, this was it was like one of the key central points of the TVPA. The ambassador that I mentioned, Lucida Baca, a former federal prosecutor who in the 1990s prosecuted a great many of these very, very large sex and labor trafficking cases throughout the country, was one of the prime movers of that. And what this victim-based approach did, it said that not only are we going to prosecute, but we actually need to be thinking about the victims, that at the end of the day, it can't just be about prosecution. So that very, very importantly, the TVPA introduced this range of benefits. Recently, many of those benefits have also been created for US citizen victims. We now realize that our largest pool of sex trafficking victims, they're not our foreign national girls and women, although that was very much the focus initially 20 years ago of human trafficking legislation and efforts, but that it's our own US citizen children, oftentimes chronic runaways, kids that are living on the streets. Many of them are sex trafficking victims, so that there have been new and additional resources that, especially on a state-by-state basis, have been created for that victim population. One caveat, though, that the TVPA only offers a lot of those victims those kinds of benefits if they're willing to assist law enforcement with what's called a reasonable request for victim compliance. And unfortunately, what that's led to is the idea that law enforcement can also control who gets those benefits, and that if a victim is not willing to take part in a prosecution, if they're not willing to take part, say, testify in an open court against their trafficker, law enforcement might not endorse their application for what's called a T visa, a trafficking visa. So there's been, I think, a very strong and appropriate human rights critique of that. Now, Congress did it clearly because they could not get successful prosecutions without victims, without victim witnesses. So that was clearly part of the TVPA. We don't talk about it as true human rights law. It's actually prosecutorial law with some human rights incidental benefits. But it still at the same time embraced what we call this victim-centered approach that today still at the heart of the U.S. sort of response to human trafficking. And that, again, says we have to look at it from the perspective of victims. A lot of the trainings that I do for law enforcement or prosecutors are, how does that get played out in an investigation? You're doing an interview, not an interrogation with a potential victim. You're not doing it with a badge and a gun in full sight. You're not threatening them. If you're a prosecutor, you have to think of what are the reasons that a victim witness might be reluctant to confront their trafficker on an open stand. What kinds of coercion are being exerted against them, threats against their family or their children back in the home country, asking us to think through how does the victim experience human trafficking and also experience our efforts to both investigate it and prosecute it. We still have a ways to go on that, but it's a very, very important paradigm for us to have espoused.
And does it vary from state to state?
Well, this is federal law, so that in theory it doesn't. State by state, though, depending on how well their own law enforcement or how well their own prosecutors are trained, states were slow in some ways to follow federal law. The federal law came out in 2000. It took almost another 15 years before every single state in the country, Wyoming was one of the last, to actually also implement state statutes against human trafficking. Why that's so important is that federal law enforcement doesn't have a beat. They respond to calls from the community, but unlike our state and local law enforcement who do walk a beat, they know their communities. It's been very important for us to train our state and local law enforcement on human trafficking because they're the ones that will most certainly investigate it and be the first ones to see it.
And so at the federal level, do you anticipate changes with the new administration in level of awareness of this or activity regarding both sex and labor trafficking?
Yeah, well, and the politics of immigration are a moving target, as we all know. I think there is a sense of confidence that we may move away from a completely prosecutorial border control kind of paradigm. I mean, that has been the paradigm of the United States in recent years, and that has had significant consequences for survivors, victims of human trafficking. Much less likely to self-identify, much less likely to ever want to come forward and cooperate with law enforcement. So that signal alone may be very, very important. On the legal field too, it's very difficult to get asylum if you're a human trafficking victim. And that some of that has to do with the legal requirements for asylum, but that historically trafficking victims have had difficulty proving that they belong in what we call the 5 enumerated grounds: persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or a particular social group. Human trafficking doesn't fit very neatly within any of those enumerated grounds, so that asylum has not been a very viable option for our trafficking survivors. So we're still wrapping our heads around how can we better protect victims? Also, how can we better identify and protect our own U.S. citizens who are vulnerable? Increasingly, we're seeing those U.S. citizen victims, whether they're special needs, teen runaways, any number of different victims, homeless people, people with a substance abuse problem, they also deserve very much our attention and our care.
So I'm going to read one of them that's come in. One can talk about profit as a problem, but the world needs profit. Isn't it true that the vast majority of businesses do not exploit? Or said another way, businesses and citizens informed are perhaps the areas of greatest leverage to combat human trafficking?
Yeah, I would agree with that last statement. We absolutely are the best means for combating trafficking. And quite a few of our businesses are learning that you can do well by doing good. And this is the lesson of some of the Immokalee workers. But it's also, if you look at the chocolate industry or any number of businesses, the hotel industry, back in 2004, one of our great advocacy groups called ECPAT introduced what was called the Code for the Hospitality Industry, in which hotels, and Carlson Hotels was the first group to belly up to the bar and say, yes, we will accept this code, that we will do everything we can to eradicate child sex trafficking in our hotels. We'll train our employees. We'll also basically enforce this, and we'll basically talk to our consumers about this. And the lesson learned was that people will prefer that hotel, and that this has been the great lesson that many of our businesses have learned, that again, by espousing or by taking on that kind of commitment to combat trafficking, by doing it publicly, by implementing trainings for their employees, and again, not just something that's just very superficial, but that consumers reward that behavior. As consumers too, if we're willing to pay a penny or two more for some of our commodities, that's also a very important thing. That again, not always going for the cheapest price, but doing some of the research and asking who deserves our consumer dollar.
Is there good sources to help consumers figure that out?
Well, there are any number of sort of evolving websites. You can look at, say, if you Google fair foods or any kind of commodity that you buy, Google it and do fair labor standards or transparency in supply chains. And it will actually typically bring you to the website for that company. It does require a little more time, a little more investment on our time as consumers, but it's very, very important, as the Coalition of Immokalee Workers demonstrated. And again, it was our college students who were kind of a discrete, in some way kind of an insular kind of subgroup, as it were, that it was their consumer dollars that were crucial to a number of industries. So that this, I think, is really the way for us to go. Also, simply telling people, if we are shareholders, our Catholic sisters have done phenomenal work, not just in terms of the actual care that they provide for trafficking victims, and they've done phenomenal grassroots work, but also their role as investors and shareholders. Many of our Catholic women's congregations hold land or actually own a lot of buildings, and that they oftentimes have their shareholders in any number of corporations. They have been quite effective as a voting bloc when it comes to demanding accountability from those corporations. So once again, our Catholic sisters have set the standard for us in so many ways.
Is there any question has come in about prison labor? Is there any discussion around prison labor and forced labor and?
Well, there is, and it's a recent discussion here in the United States, and that some of it has to do with privately owned prisons. That's a separate human rights issue on its own. Should companies be allowed to actually operate a prison for profit? Because it oftentimes means minimizing the level of care or sustenance for prisoners who have, of course, no choice but to be there. There's raised significant legal and moral issues there. But the question, too, whenever there's any kind of labor being done by prisoners, does not what may be happening in the United States not look too distant from what might be happening in the People's Republic of China? That we have to ask ourselves that uncomfortable question. And in an era in which prisons have been increasingly privatized, that's a really significant issue.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to pass this back to Professor Graf in case he has a couple questions from the Labor Institute standpoint. But I want to personally thank you again. And I know I fire-started a bunch of questions at you, and that was fun from my end, but you held up well, so thank you. And I'm going to pass it back to Terry.
Well, thank you, Vickie, and thanks again. This has been a great forum.
Yeah, thanks, Vickie, and thanks, Terry. Professor Coonan, it's been a wonderful talk. I'm going to ask one more question from the Q&A because we have a couple of minutes left, even though we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, and I appreciate people's patience there. But a question, somebody asked, what about your Notre Dame education and experience has informed your human rights work? Besides Father Don McNeil and Sister Judith, were there other influences on you in this way? And I'm going to add a question that's related to that, which is, what about current Notre Dame and other students? What is your advice for those who are interested in getting into either human rights law, or the fight against human trafficking and forced labor, what would you recommend for the undergraduate or the law student to do? So I guess that's a couple questions combined right there, Terry.
Sure. In answer to that, I have to thank Notre Dame. It was not just a well-rounded liberal arts education, but one that was just basically informed by Catholic values. And I remain so grateful for that. Very grateful to the Congregation of Holy Cross, that again, my affiliation with them for a number of years did a great deal also to kind of shape really what I do now as a human rights advocate. Interestingly, several years that I spent in Chile while I was actually a seminarian with Holy Cross, thought I would be doing mostly teaching, but a great deal of my work ended up being work with torture survivors. This was during the Pinochet regime. And it was really my first introduction to trauma. We didn't have a lot of the language, again, 25, 30 years ago for trauma. And what I realized now was that the trauma that I saw and worked with a number of survivors, many of them my own age at that point in time, is now what I see with human trafficking survivors, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So that a great many of the experiences that Notre Dame and Holy Cross enabled me to sort of take on greatly, greatly formed and shaped me and continue to really inform what I do now. I got another great question too, Dan, about, what's the future of kind of work in the human rights field? It's a more expansive field than ever before. When I first looked at it, it was primarily a legal field. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I pursued human rights law, but I'm fond of saying that human rights are far too important to be left to the lawyers of the world, and that human rights is increasingly an interdisciplinary field. It's what we do. Our Human Rights Center here at FSU is a testimony to that, but really the great things going on at Notre Dame, also a testimony to the kind of difference makers that people can be. Very, very important, I think, to have human rights sensibilities, whether we're going on for law, for business, for medicine, social work, any number of different fields, I think are greatly enhanced by being informed about human rights issues and human rights sensibilities. So now the answer is, is clearly not just law school, but that graduate school, but with a focus on the human person. And that's where I love about our Catholic social teachings, that foundational notion of the inherent value of the human. And that's so important because so much of what we see in the contemporary world runs counter to that, human trafficking just being one example. But a great many of the fields that our Notre Dame grads can go on for could have tremendous impact on the world of human rights.
Thanks so much. This is probably a good time to note, I don't know, it was so great to hear you talk about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Notre Dame students in particular, but the Center for Social Concerns has a long-standing relationship with the CIW. So Notre Dame was one of those hotbeds of student activism in that initial Taco Bell boycott campaign, including some of my former students. And the university athletic department had a contract with Taco Bell at the time and never admitted that the boycott had an impact on its decision not to renew that contract, but it wasn't renewed in the midst of that boycott, which the student activists appropriately claimed as a victory. So Notre Dame was one of those places where that was getting started. And at the Center for Social Concerns, we have immersion seminars and that feature trips during the fall or spring break to deepen and enhance the learning that students are doing in the classroom on issues. And there's a partnership, there's a migrant farm worker seminar that is a regular offering and that involves going to Immokalee and meeting with farm workers and with the CIW advocates and activists. So it's great to see all these connections being made. And I encourage students to get involved in some of these seminar activities. Certainly reach out to me if they're interested. Thanks so much, Professor Coonan. We've run out of time for tonight. We did record this, so people who weren't able to make it or would like to revisit some of the slides are able to access that. Everybody who RSVP'd will send out the link to that recording when it's finalized in public. Again, let's all give a Notre Dame thank you to Professor Coonan for returning home, even if only virtually. And I hope you'll all join us on Thursday, March 18th for the second installment of this series. That one's titled Confronting Human Trafficking, Understanding the Roles of Government, business, law enforcement, and victim leadership. There'll be 3 panelists. I'll just mention one of those. Bridget Carr is another Notre Dame alum who is a clinical professor of law and director of the Human Trafficking Clinic at the University of Michigan. So we're excited to have another Notre Dame grad with us that night. Thank you all again. Thank you to Terry Coonan. Thank you to Vickie Seeger for moderating the discussion, and for all of you for participating. Have a good, safe, warm night, and we'll see you in a month, if not before. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thanks, and go Irish.